My name is Becky Sasakamoose-Kuffner, and I'm the co-chair of the National Urban Indigenous Coalitions Council, along with my colleague Jean-François Coté, who is not here to join us today. However, we do have our two panelists, Damien Johnson and Kamala Todd. I'd like to start out, first of all, by just introducing myself a little bit, and then I will invite the panelists to also share some comments about their own personal context and experience and how it is that they bring their own identities to be able to do this work. So I am from Treaty 6 territory, Ahtahkakoop Cree Nation originally, and I currently live and work in Treaty 6 territory in the city of Saskatoon. I am a 60s scoop survivor, so I was raised in foster care with white parents. And I, from that experience, came to understand the way that the world works through an anti-racist lens. So I practice with an anti-racist perspective that I bring to do this work. And I've worked in government at all three levels of mainstream colonial government. From the provincial level, I started my career, and then I worked with the federal government, and now I work with the provincial government, or with the municipal government. So I currently work with the municipality, the city of Saskatoon, and I have for the past 14 years worked as an anti-racism practitioner, and I am currently the business lead for the Systemic Motions Project with the municipal government. And I've been a part of the national coalition right from the beginning of the Urban Aboriginal Strategy in 2004 or 5, and now very happy to be a part of the new iteration of the Urban Indigenous Strategy, or the UPIP programming for urban Indigenous peoples. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining us at our Knowledge Mobilisation Hub event. And if, Kamala, if you would like to share some of your thoughts and by way of introduction, would be great, thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Hope everybody's blood sugar and energy are good right now, this time of day. Really great to be with you all. Thank you for including me in this conversation. Speaking to you today from what now known as Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, which is Squamish territory, but it's also an area that's, has thousands of years of relationship and history and stewardship from many nations, Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking people, and also Sechelt people further up the coast. My family and I have been living here for about 9 years, but I still keep working with the city of Vancouver and other municipalities across the water. Myself, I was born and raised all throughout what's now called Metro Vancouver. So it's the only home I've ever known, and my children were also born here. But my own ancestors on my mother's side are Cree and Métis. We have Todd, Laframboise, Desjardins, Cardinal, different family names, and we come from different Métis and Cree territories, including Red River, St. Paul de Métis settlement, Whitefish, Goodfish Lake, Turtle Mountain, and so on. And I can say the names of those places thanks to my auntie doing our genealogy and some family history, but through that kinds of displacement that so many of us have experienced, I have grown up in the territories of other people. I grew up not knowing my language. My grandfather spoke Cree, but he didn't teach it to his children. And my mom has worked consistently to help us all reconnect, even while living here, because she moved out to Vancouver, as a kid, basically leaving the very racist at that time city of Edmonton. And I've really watched her. My mom's a filmmaker and activist in her own way, and I've really watched her conduct herself in a very respectful way towards the people whose lands we're on, and always carrying that sense of responsibility and reciprocity. And also my childhood, was spent at the Friendship Center, what we called the Indian Center back then. And it really was a mix of people who are from these lands and people who were from many other lands. And Vancouver really has been a convergence of so many people for a really long time. And so I've kind of tried to find my way in understanding what that means as somebody who is not of these lands, but who is very, in love with and connected to this place, and, unlearning and relearning what my responsibilities are and how I can carry those and how I can support the people of these lands to continue to carry their own responsibilities and rights on their lands. So I have many different things that I've worked at, mostly with the city of Vancouver, since 2000, off and on for many years, and including things like the Dialogues Project and doing films, and a project called Storyscapes that I started that's all about, kind of trying to address the colonial erasure and silencing and displacement that is really expressed in a big way in the city. And to really help all of us remember and understand that even in the city, we're on someone's territories. And of course, in the city, there are many people who also have rights and have been displaced. And what does that look like? And so I think the best example for me in that learning right now is being able to work on the UNDRIP process. That the city of Vancouver is working with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, the nations whose lands Vancouver is on, to implement UNDRIP. And so I've been privileged to help in that process, and also looking at how can the city work with urban Indigenous people to also support their rights, which are very distinct from the host nation. So happy to share examples of that and learnings from that. And yeah, just also listen. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Kamala. Kamala and I have had the pleasure of having a conversation previously, and your insights are very profound and thoughtful. So I'm looking forward to your continued sharing of your thoughts. Damon, would you please like to introduce yourself and share some of your thoughts about your takeaways in your journey so far?
Yeah, so I'm a member of the Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and it's kind of an urban reserve because it's just across the river from the cities. The city used to be two cities, Fort William and Port Arthur, and so the interaction between ourselves and other Thunder Bay citizens now the level has always been high, particularly the hockey. That was a hockey rivalry. The non-Indigenous teams would come on to the reserve and play against us and others. I've been an urban Indigenous person all my life. My grandmothers were Anishinaabe, and but they one married a person, an Irish person, and my other grandmother married a Francophone person. And so both my dad and mom, who were born on the reserve, eventually lost their status and moved off the reserve. My dad was a hunter, trapper, and guide out of a place called Ignis, Ontario, which is between here and Thunder Bay, Winnipeg and Thunder Bay, on the Trans-Canada Highway. And he was very successful, but he drowned when I was 5 years old. So I never knew my dad because he was always away. My only recollection I have of him is coming through the cabin door with furs on his back. So I was raised by a single parent mom, and a lot of chaos in my life, trauma, and somehow I got through it, and here today, and enjoying life, I guess, particularly at this point in my life. My urban experience, I paid a huge price because, of course, I lost my language, but the language loss on our reserve has been high, even for those on the reserve. But lost my language, because I didn't grow up in the community. I turned out different in some ways. Like, our community had its own sort of use of language when I first visited, and then the other differences in appearance, sometime in the way things were done, when I would visit the reserve with my mother and visit our relatives on reserve, I was always a very curious type person. So, it caused a lot of questions to pop into my head about the reserve and about my relatives on reserve and these differences that were so visible to myself. And then as I got older and continued to do that, I started to formulate or get some answers to these questions, and then caused me to start thinking about that whole Indian Act system, the creation of the reserves, and more importantly, thinking about the impacts of our people who grew up on reserves, impacts that may be different than those of us who were born off reserve and lived off reserve all our life. And in particular, I wanted to try to understand how those differences affected our peoples and what those effects, what were the outcomes of those effects, particularly when our people started to move into cities in higher numbers. And so as someone else said, like, I know our band is at half of us living off reserve, many in the city of Thunder Bay, but like me in other cities like Winnipeg. And our lives, the outcomes of our lives can be quite different relative to what our life experience was if we lived on reserve or moved, never lived on reserve or moved off reserve. There are visible different outcomes, and it's evidence-based now. I mean, there's documentation of these things. And those things, understanding those things even better, I think, is important to our future, particularly as it relates to our healing and our recovery. And our recovery, can include, recovery of your language. And many people off reserve now are taking lessons to learn their language, right? Relearn their language. So this is powerful stuff. And, we know how important language is to many groups in the world. I mean, you only have to look at Quebec and the lengths they go to protect their language, right? So why should our language be even less important to us in any way? So these are really critical elements of our future, of that self-determination, of self-government. And so another big focus of mine is around the issue of quality of leadership. Like, how important are leaders to any community anywhere? And when I say quality of leadership, I mean, to me, I told you I was 75 years of age this year. And so I look back on my life, and I look back on my life in the context of, an important element of our society, our country, politics. And what were leaders saying to us when we were young in those days, and what are they saying today? And what's different? You know what I mean? And I think one of the greatest issues facing all of mankind right now revolve around morality and ethics. And in our case, I have the 7 teachings on the wall of my boardroom. And I look at those every day. And I know, just for myself, I do not need any other guidance in my life. If I can live up to those things, good on me. But I know where I fall down every day I look at them. Truth and courage, honesty, wisdom, you know what I mean? What's more powerful?
With that, Damon, that might actually lead quite nicely into one of the questions actually that I have for both you and Kamala. And that is, when we're talking about governance, what do we mean by governance? And what does it mean to speak about urban governance on Indigenous territories and in Indigenous territories? So maybe if you would like to continue with that thought about what does it mean to speak about urban governance on Indigenous territories? And then perhaps we'll, Kamala, you can share your thoughts after Damon.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, I think most of you will know that there's quite a bit of literature on urban self-government. In fact, this council has some in its archives, where we've over the years talked to our members about, you know, what would urban self-government look like in Winnipeg? You know, how could it work? Because when the urban communities first developed in Winnipeg, there was nothing. You know, we created the first organization, which was the, you know, sort of modern day organization, was the Indian and Métis Friendship Center of Winnipeg in 1958. And so you fast forward to 2022, and we have over 35 different organizations that are not owned by First Nations, not owned by Métis, not owned by Inuit. They're truly urban organizations. And in Winnipeg, they were, almost all of them were co-created by a mix of Métis and First Nations persons, because historically the Inuit community here was very small, and they really didn't form the Manitoba Inuit Association until a few years ago. So the bulk of those 35 organizations since 1958 have been the backbone of program and service delivery, development and delivery to urban Indigenous persons, whether they're Métis, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And they still are the backbone. Now, the First Nations, AMC, Southern Chiefs Organization, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Southern Chiefs Organization, Northern Chiefs, MKO, they are starting to build urban capacity. And now individual First Nations are opening offices in Winnipeg to be able to better serve some of their urban citizens. And then you have the advent of urban reserves, which are extensions of the original reserve in the city. And in some cases, like the Kapiong Barracks, which has its own name now, given by I think the 7 First Nations who share that city property, 100 and something plus acres for development, you know, is again a huge change in the sort of Indigenous platform in Winnipeg, and huge evidence of the growing capacity of First Nations in this case to extend themselves into cities, you know, with new land acquisition. And so the longer term outcomes of that kind of activity, particularly from the economic, spiritual, emotional, cultural side, is the future is just, it's amazing. I mean, I give thought to it, and I know, you know, and I know from the evidence of the urban reserves in Saskatchewan, and then of changes in some reserves that are located in cities or towns in British Columbia, the tremendous opportunities that these places offer to First Nations, and the different outcomes that occur when they undertake those activities. So as an urban leader and part of that historic urban Indigenous platform, we now have to think about, you know, how do we currently work with First Nations specific, Métis specific, and Inuit specific organizations and leadership? You know, what is the nature of our current relationship with them? And in other words, is it informal? In other words, it's just day to day, you know, it's sort of casual. It's not, there's no formal agreements, written agreements of any kind as to what the nature of the relationship is or should be or could be, you know what I mean? But we're conscious of that, and we're now going to take action to realize it.
So Damon, you sit on one of the only political urban Indigenous organizations in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so can you share what some of your experiences are and what the relationship it is that particular organization, the urban, and what is the name of it?
It's called the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg.
Aboriginal Council of
Yeah,
Winnipeg. And what is the relationship to the municipality or to the province or?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a working relationship. So I'm on the Mayor's Indigenous Advisory Circle, right? Because of who I am and the organization that I lead. And now the establishment of the Winnipeg Indigenous Executive Circle, so there are 32 organizations. And I just okayed a memorandum of understanding between the council and WIAC, the Winnipeg Indigenous. Okay, so it's a formal agreement. And then the council, as I said earlier, is as I'm aware of, is the only urban political organization in the whole country for a city. And so the city of Winnipeg has an accord, an Indigenous accord, and it's committed to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that apply to municipalities. But it also, because of the nature of our relationship, we can influence future policy, Indigenous policy of the city, legislation, if that's applicable, and formal agreements to do things. You know what I mean? So again, historically, most of our interaction with the municipal government is of sort of an informal nature. In other words, there's no written agreement between any organization in the city as to how they will work together, that will guide how they do things together. Okay, so example, the old Indian Métis Friendship Center of Winnipeg, as I said earlier, established in 1958, in its true sense, is a Aboriginal community center in Winnipeg. Now, the city has a whole system of community centers, but the Friendship Center was never part of that. And so it missed out on certain opportunities that being a member of that structure could offer. You know what I mean? And it also missed out on having a more formal relationship with the city and answering the question like, how can the city of Winnipeg better support the Friendship Center as an Indigenous community center? And more importantly, the programming that it offers for children, youth, adults, you know, etc., seniors, elders, right? So we're starting to work on that now, and we're already starting to see some benefits of that. And because we're going to build a new Friendship Center now, our old Friendship Center, we lost it. So now we lost the Indian Métis Friendship Center. So now we have the Winnipeg Indigenous Friendship Center, and we are undertaking to build a more formal relationship with the city of Winnipeg and to become a recognized community center, Indigenous community center in this city. And we want more of them. In fact, we already are working on a second one. So that experience has already demonstrated to us in real time some benefits, and we see more in the future. And that's for urban Indigenous organizations. That doesn't include at the moment the First Nations, the Métis, or the Inuit. They're doing their own stuff with the city. Okay, and that's all legitimate because they have many members of their bands living in the city of Winnipeg. So again, we've adopted a goodwill approach to a respectful approach. What do you call it? Recognizing the diversity of First Nations. Okay, right? Because they're not all the same. We have 5 major tribes here in Winnipeg. So yeah, and then as we go forward, we will consciously do other things to try and strengthen all of that. And
I think when I first came on, Jamin, I was hearing, perspective that you were bringing about how fundamentally different mainstream governance and decision making is really built around. For Indigenous people, it's the collective that comes first, and for mainstream, it's the individual. So there's a fundamental difference, really, that creates a very, very big divide between how decisions are made and for what purpose decisions are made. And it's interesting to me that municipalities really ought to be concerned with the well-being of the community, but yet decisions are often made based on power and money continuously. Yeah. So Indigenous people, I feel, do, as you are saying, have a very, very critical role in being a part of that decision making. And it's interesting that, the position that you're in Winnipeg, to be able to sit on that advisory circle, like the organization. So it'll be interesting to see, moving forward in the future, if there are more organizations that represent urban Indigenous people that are of a political nature.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm hoping by strengthening our relationship with First Nations and Métis and Indian, who are the rights holders. We view them as the rights holders, right? Yeah. And so we know that the national chief and the national president of the MNC and the ITK, that they're meeting with the Prime Minister's representatives, his ministers, right? Almost on a daily basis. And they're telling the Prime Minister and the members of cabinet that they represent us wherever we live, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. But to me, that representation has to be real. It has to be valid.
Yeah.
It has to result in changes in a lot of things, right?
Yes, it still is problematic. But I do want to give Kamala an opportunity to be able to go ahead with your thoughts. So Kamala, to you, what does it mean to speak about urban governance on Indigenous territories, and what do we mean by governance?
Yeah, I guess someone, who has been, I feel I'm more of a kind of observer, learner, witness, in trying to figure out what that looks like here. Many teachings. So I think for me, it starts with the land, relationship to land, rights and title that flow from the land and what that looks like. It's the expression of how people live and their right and to self-determine what that looks like. And all the 150 plus years of interference with those rights and discounting of the strength, beauty, brilliance, vitality of those governance systems and ways that the people live and organize themselves and make decisions. So much of what we've observed is the continuous fight and work to be able to continue those practices and all the ways that they change and stay dynamic, to be able to continue those rights to self-determination, to be decision makers for your land, to be stewards of your land, to create the decision-making processes that work for your community according to your own laws and teachings and so on. So obviously it looks different for different people. And then when we're in the city, it's that same recognition that, Indigenous people have rights, have always had rights, and all the interference has meant, and all the dislocation has meant, trying to find what that looks like in an urban setting when you have people from many different places, and then the rights and title holders who have their own, laws and governance systems that have been in place here forever. And so as I look back, so for example, my mom shared with me several years ago a whole bunch of her notes and papers from work that she did in the 80s when she was a student intern at the Museum of Anthropology, and they were basically doing research on kind of the history of Indigenous people in Vancouver, like as a city, like since settlement. And there's pages and pages of notes, and it's incredible. And what's the most common thread throughout is a non-stop efforts and expression towards advocating for rights, maintaining rights, basically all the different times that despite all the oppressive racist laws, genocidal, policies about restricting people's ability to fight for their rights, even within the system, even if it meant, trying to have legal representation, which was prohibited for many years, and all the different ways that Indigenous people have continuously affirmed the right to land, title to land, the right to self-determination, to voice, and to live as according to their own systems. It's been continuous. And obviously it did heat up, as Damon said, a lot of it kind of heated up in the 60s in terms of more people moving into the city. And then of course the white paper and things like that created all kinds of response. But it's just so inspiring to see, but also very sad to see this continuous struggle for the very basics. Self-governance also, to me, just recently spent some time with Marjorie Bocage, who you may know, Becky, from Saskatchewan area. She came and spent some time with our family, and she talks about self-governance over oneself. And again, like the right to, bodily autonomy and identity, and been thinking about that a lot lately as well. And it's something that I think, traditionally all of our communities upheld, is one's right to, be who we are, to carry our own medicine, to carry our own teachings, our own sense of self and identity and our gifts. And so of course, as my children are at that age, kind of 16 and 21 of really trying to know who they are and their place in the world and their connection to land. Governance also relates to that for me as well, and the right to determine who we are and make our decisions for ourselves, which is also by extension what Indigenous communities experience. So in terms of Vancouver, I have witnessed all kinds of different attempts to try to create that unified voice, or to try to create governance systems, decision-making bodies that can replicate and bring together. I believe that universally all Indigenous nations do have the kind of concept of the circle and an inclusive circle of decision making, that we're all part of the circle, all ages, all genders, all everything that we bring. And so it has been an ongoing struggle for that. I witnessed the Vancouver Aboriginal Council, which was going for a while, which was great, but didn't really have a ton of political voice beyond, sharing information. And we would attend as a city, but yeah, but it was still great in terms of that dialogue and sharing and advocating for each other. But so many organizations that have started up to support each other and to make sure that people are included. Yeah, but there's so many to name. And right now, the big one in Vancouver is the Metro Vancouver Aboriginal Executive Council, which is representatives from different agencies, so more service provider, but definitely, important groups that were all started by Indigenous people, wanting to ensure that we have representation and voice and support, so that we can all enjoy a good quality of life. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kamala. So with those thoughts, what lessons or policy frameworks and/or strategies could help create the changes that we want to see, do you think, from your perspective and your experience?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
I think the biggest thing is the reality is the wider public attitude and the ongoing racism and the ongoing colonial oppression, which does still limit people's self-determination. And hopefully the UNDRIP work will help really affirm Indigenous people's rights to self-determination and rights and title in general. But I do still feel that the education and the awareness amongst the wider public is really needed for people to really know and understand that it's not something from the past, that they are still on the lands of sovereign nations who have rights and title, who have governance systems and laws, and to really start to embed that. And I really feel like the city will gradually, slowly start to go that way, and it has been, the city of Vancouver, in kind of, there hasn't been a change to the charter, the colonial government law that the city has, that gives it authority to be the decision maker for these lands. Of course, it doesn't really have the authority, but it claims the authority. But I feel like there will be changes gradually to that in terms of shared decision making and shared revenue and all of that. I believe we will get there. But it's helping people understand, because there's like that backlash and the sort of flare-ups of racism that are so harmful, where people say, okay, whatever, yeah, First Nations, whatever, anyway, this is where we're at, and just get over it, move on. But to really help people embed that sense that they are on the lands of sovereign nations, and what does that mean? And so I'm actually very inspired, and still learning what it looks like to, like, as nations revitalize their laws, and like as you talk about, in NUICC talks about, stories have always been our governance. So the work that's happening now in revitalizing Indigenous laws, and I find a lot of inspiration from Tsleil-Waututh Nation and how they are, really boldly, visibly, actively enacting their laws to care for their inlet, for example, and articulating that and helping bring the rest of us along in supporting their rights to be the stewards of their inlet, and that those of us who live here need to kind of take that on and follow their lead, and kind of follow their laws. So I think in urban context, people again think of it as a non-native place, and that erasure has been so severe that the more the stories come out, the more that the visibility is there. And that's why I also love to work with public art and film and oral history and even signage, all of that as part of addressing that erasure. You can see it, you can see the shifts that start to happen, where people increasingly know whose lands they're on, and that the people are still here and they still retain those rights and title and connections. So those are the things that I think will help us slowly get to that point. And the kind of ongoing struggle and complexity of how us urban Indigenous people can also have our rights recognized and exercised, and on someone else's territory, and what that looks like. I also feel like we're getting to that understanding slowly but surely, in terms of protocols, in terms of feeling welcome, but also acknowledging that we don't have title rights to these lands, because sometimes when we're in a city, it might feel like it's just a city, but we're still on someone's territory. So figuring out what that looks like is also the next step in the UNDRIP work in Vancouver. And I feel like we will get to an understanding about that gradually over time. I'll just quickly share that I personally carry with me a teaching from Leonard George, the late Leonard George from Tsleil-Waututh Nation, of his vision that he was working towards is at the Plaza of Nations. It was the space that was created for Expo, on his people's lands. And so it carried that idea of the Plaza of Nations, many nations, and he was working towards a vision of creating a place for all nations. And it was, this inclusive vision of creating cultural space for people of all Indigenous communities to come together and practice their culture and their governance and everything in this place, as hosted by Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and very clearly. And so that vision, I think, is sort of like what it's like in the city, that we are on the lands of the people who are still here, and their languages and their laws and governance and so on. And we can, work towards our own wellness and self-governance, and what that looks like in someone else's lands. So yeah, those are the things that I guess keep me going and a little bit hopeful. Thank you.
That's such a lovely idea, actually, that Plaza of Nations. So just for, some clarity, I know that we've been having these conversations about what actually are we trying to make happen. And I wanted to pose this question perhaps to both of you, and however, if either of you would like to be able to share a few thoughts. We're going to break in about 5 minutes. So just a couple of last thoughts, perhaps, on the idea of self-determination. So what does that look like then for urban Indigenous people who are participating and have a right to be able to participate in mainstream governance? Because if we are accessing equitable services, not only just for Indigenous people, but what are we looking to create? Are we looking at creating, you know, the two-row wampum where Indigenous people continue along their row and don't intersect? And the mainstream stays within their own system of governance and we equally travel down the river, separate but together? Or are we looking at, you know, an integration of changing the mainstream governance structures so that they actually create equitable outcomes for everyone and that are better for everyone? So I'm interested in your thoughts on that for either of you.
Yeah, I think, okay, so here I'm going to share something I think would be interesting. So we're not the only tribal peoples in the world. So if you look at the country now called the United Arab Emirates, right, a leader brought 14 different tribes together to form that country. So it's not inconceivable that we, you know, could create a governance model in a city of Winnipeg that would include all of us. You know what I mean? The First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit, and the urban. And you know, I've thought of one model where you have the collective sort of government at the top functioning, and then underneath that you would have another structure for the First Nations, for the Métis, for the Inuit, and for the urban, to build their own consensus on issues of the day facing that bigger government, right? So that's just one thought, you know what I mean? Because we know there's strength in numbers. There's an economic equation that's important in collective. But there's also the opportunity to change how some things work in Canadian society and other societies. So for example, now if you look at colonialism in its purest form, in other words, the control of others by some, okay? In the case of Canada, the Indian Act gave the government absolute control of Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And in its first rendition, we weren't human beings. We weren't considered human beings, okay? But we were, absolutely we were. And all peoples of the world were tribal at one time. We know that too. Even, you know, yeah. So we all have those origins in common. The big question we have to answer, I think, as Indigenous people, under this umbrella of self-determination, self-government, is, you know, what do we want? How do we want our government to function? How do we want things within government? So our economic development sector, our businesses, our banks. Okay, so I'm going to use that as an example. We have in Winnipeg the only Indigenous credit union in all of Canada, the Median Credit Union, Métis Indian Credit Union. Okay, and I'm on the board. Okay, right now that credit union has to function exactly the same as other credit unions in Manitoba. But we're serving an entirely different population, group of people, right? We're serving First Nations, we're serving Métis, we're serving Inuit and urban. And we know the differences. And we want to be able to operate our bank or our credit union in a better way to serve our Indigenous customer base. But we can't do that right now because the governance structure of the credit union is a non-Indigenous structure imposed on us, right, by current legislation. Now, I will argue that under UNDRIP and under self-determination, we should be able to negotiate the changes we want in our credit union to be able to better serve our customers. right? For our people. And we have good examples of how we could do that. Okay. Now, you go back now, I mentioned earlier, morals and ethics and value system. Okay. So the credit union system right now is based on a platform of non-Indigenous morals, ethics, values, and law, right? What would an Indigenous credit union look like? Guided by our own morals, ethics, values, laws, right?
And how can we translate that, from one organization into a municipal government, into a provincial government, into a federal government, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Kamala, can you share your thoughts on what on that kind of issue?
Sure. I guess we're trying to wrap by 12:30 for a break, right? So
yeah, we're gonna take a bit of a break and give the translators a break, and then we'll come back after and then just have an open discussion. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So on that note, definitely that sentiment of self-determined structure. I guess I'll just say that personally, as I look at the laws, the original laws of the land, they should be the laws guiding how we live on the land, because that's how people lived for thousands of years, and it is what the law of the land. Sure, if people want to talk about, weaving together, Western ways and other ways as well, that's where we're at. So, it's not like it's going to be a displacement, but I do feel like, I'll quote another Tsleil-Waututh person who's really inspires me. Recently, Charlene Alec, counselor at Tsleil-Waututh Nation, said, that saying about when in Rome, and she said, when in Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory, do as Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh do. And it's just that shift, that people have around, and it's not like Indigenous people constantly having to prove that they have title to their lands, that they have a right to be there, that the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, erasure has been so successful and so powerful that people just don't see and understand whose lands they're on and what that means. So the more, again, we address that erasure and remind people that these are nations, these are governments, and get to that point where, yeah, those original laws, which of course have changed and adapted over time, but still hold that the original laws and knowledge of the land, that should be shaping how things are done. And I see it happening. I do see it happening at the city, new ways that decision making happens or how projects happen, in trying to take the lead of the host nations who have small population, but are doing their best. So the two-row wampum belt, I think, is a really beautiful thing to look at in terms of the original understandings and that generosity and that welcoming that, all of our ancestors extended to the newcomers in terms of, okay, yes, we will share, but you let us continue in our ways and don't interfere with our ways, and we won't interfere with yours. But that wasn't honored. And so now we're at that stage where I personally do feel that the original people and their rights and title and laws and governance has more power and weight and should trump the colonial imposed, made up laws and governance systems. But, that's the more extreme view, but weaving together at the very least, so that, because I think a lot of people also think, oh, well, when you settle land claims or when you look at the treaty or when you, and even for urban Indigenous people too, like I think people think, oh, it's only going to be for within your own community. But no, it's also land-based and it's also society-based. The original people have the laws and the governance systems that should be, at least to some degree, guiding how decision-making happens on this land. So it's not just for reserve, it's not just for the urban Indigenous, organizations, it's for all of us. And that's how we can disrupt that erasure and that segregation that we've lived with for so long. So that's where I see it going, and hope that we can get to.
I think that is a very beautiful thought, and it's not only exciting, but it's also very inspiring to think that. And I want to thank both of you very much, for all of your thoughts and sparking conversations. I think we'll take a break for 5 minutes. And then when we come back, we're looking to be able to have an open discussion about key issues. What are some models that are currently working, protocols, and what is the role that NUICC can play in lifting up urban Indigenous governance? Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to maybe refill your coffee, get some water, go to the bathroom. So for the last half an hour, for 20 minutes, I just want to open the floor to folks who have questions for either Damon or Kamala. Or if you have comments on some of the discussion, or if you'd like to make any observations. So I'd just like to, once everybody gets back and comfortable, just open the floor if anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to make.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me here. It's been really informative. I do have one question throughout the presentations. Is there's been a references to consensus decision-making models and inclusive voice of decision-making. Are they one and the same, or is one a component of the other?
I mean, you probably have more experience with that than me in terms of consensus base. I would see them as different for sure.
Oh, absolutely. You know, our current system isn't that we live in, our governance system at the highest level, federal, provincial, municipal, etc., is not, certainly not consensus based, or we'd have better decisions, especially on, you know, important issues of the day. And, you know, we live in a you know, very structured system that is sort of by design rewards some at the expense of others in many different ways. And, you know, I say that's that huge difference between, you know, the rights of the collective versus the rights of the individual is just so important in terms of you know, what is happening in our society over many years now, and how people become marginalized, excluded, you know, non-participants in any real way in their society. You know, that's been the outcome for far too many Indigenous persons. And then, you know, the actions that were taken against us via the Indian Act, the creation of the residential schools, day schools, 60 scoop, you know, sterilization, any of those ugly things that we know were perpetrated on us were possible because of the structure of Canadian governance. And, you know, what I said earlier yesterday was that we now have an opportunity, more than we've ever had, to truly change Canada. And I know that because we created Thunderbird House in Winnipeg. And Thunderbird House is built on a medicine wheel thinking, right? So anyone can come to Thunderbird House, and anyone has come to Thunderbird House. And many of the non-Indigenous people who have participated in our ceremonies, you know, in our discussions, they change. And they change in real ways. The problem is not enough of them have that opportunity. Now, you and I know, because of racism and discrimination, that there are groups in our society who hate us, right? Who want to physically attack us. But they're not the majority. And, but it's also being proven that even some of those individuals can change. There's examples at a world level of that. But, you know, how do you bring, the question we have to answer is how do you bring that into a better focus, and how do you change people for the better? Well, we're doing that, I think. But our impact right now is limited because of our limited resources.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Going forward, we can't only think about some things to do. We have to think about all things to do. One of our greatest weaknesses is our need to get money from governments. You know, even our political movement is owned by the governments. It's bought and paid for by them. That's not freedom. Just look across the border at the NAACP, the National Organization for, you know, African Americans. The majority of its funding is from themselves, but they're different than us. They have billionaires like Oprah Winfrey. You know, we don't have those kind of people in our community yet. We have some multimillionaires, but no billionaires. But going forward, we have to really look at and take action to exercise options that we haven't in the past. And we have to reach out to some of these people with money and, you know, get them to fund some of our activity. And that's not against the law. They do it in the United States already. So, and other organizations do it in Canada. So, for example, I just connected with Richard Branson the other day on LinkedIn. And I'm going to have a good conversation with Mr. Branson. And he's the kind of business leader that's a little different than many others. And in the end, he just may be willing to give me or someone else some money to do some of the work that we need to do. You know, so we got to look at, you know, some of the weaknesses in, for lack of a better description, our warriors dress and you know, and start to address those weaknesses.
I think too,
Because
if we look to, you know, where there are successful, you know, examples or successful models or frameworks that are based on consensus or based on inclusive decision making, and if we find success in those, then it may make it that there may be more understanding or belief in the value of those decision making models. Kamala, I'm
yeah,
not sure if you had a thought on that.
I mean, just in thinking in general, because I definitely don't have a lot of expertise on what those decision-making processes look like both traditionally and now, because of course, a lot has been disrupted. Certainly the UNDRIP process that we're part of, it's got representation from all three nations council and City of Vancouver Council. It is following a consensus-based model, but those are representative. So it's obviously not the full community. So there's that question too. So I think when I brought up the circle earlier, like what I and what I'm continuing to learn about is just the idea that we all have a place in the circle, that we all belong. And for young people, for elders, for, you know, two-spirited people, for gender diverse people, that hasn't always felt like in Canadian society, Western society, and all the discrimination and, you know, segregation and individualism and everything, and the idea of who the most you know, the experts and the authorities and the supreme people are, has, you know, contributed to that idea that some people deserve more than others, that some people have a voice and some people are irrelevant, and all those different, you know, really problematic mindsets of Western culture that was, you know, imposed here. That's what I feel like we're healing through and have to kind of restore our, you know, some people think it's romantic, some people think it's, you know, generalizing or stereotyping, but I firmly believe that Indigenous communities traditionally have that understanding that we are all part of the circle, and we all have our own gifts and value and medicine and what we bring. And so it's restoring that in terms of the circle and ways of living And so I see that where young people are constantly having to, kind of request a seat at the table or be recognized as having knowledge and rights and, all the intersectional ways that we experience the world. So to me, that's partly what it's about. We may have elected or hereditary leadership who can make those decisions on our behalf. But for me, I'm just thinking more about that we all feel that we matter and that we're loved and cared for and part of that circle. So that's what that means to me.
Yeah, another important thought in this is the demonstration to others that something can truly work better for everyone, not just for the group that does it a certain way. And I think we as Indigenous peoples have to do more of that. And I think, the opportunities for us to do that, that's where UNDRIP comes in. You know what I mean? In the negotiation of self-government models for Indigenous peoples in Canada, it's critical what our leadership is putting on the table for discussion. And then not rushing to judgment. That's where consensus comes in. If a train is coming at you, you have to jump out of the way. If a buffalo is coming at you, you jump out of the way, right? So that's the kind of decisions that have to be immediate. But for other topics where these things are really important to all of us as Canadians or as Indigenous peoples, then we have to make a decision to give it more time, not rush to judgment. And as I said earlier, so far, all of our structure is taken from others. It's not from us. What we still do in our ceremonies is very real in terms of what we did, right? We try to honor those historic ways of knowing, being, and doing, but we're not doing it in enough yet. So we have to apply that to other things and to governance. So we're going to answer the question, what does Indigenous governance look like in a modern day context? And as I said earlier, we can create hybrids. In other words, we're not saying to Canadians anywhere else that we're better than you. We're saying that we've done things differently. We do things differently. And when we do that, if you see it and you like it, then why shouldn't we together try to put it in play in our country? You know what I mean? And that's why I use the Thunderbird House example, because when those individuals actually come and sit with us and learn how to do, are willing to learn from us, truly learn from us, and then want to adopt some of these things, is there something wrong with that? You know what I mean? Does it make them better people? If that's the answer, then why shouldn't we let them continue to participate, to learn from us, to grow with us? You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's essential. And if we don't harvest that, then our future, I think, is dimmer. So yeah, I mean.
Agreed, Damon. Yeah. Thank you for that question, Lorraine. Are there any other thoughts that anybody would like to share or have comments?
I'm struggling to put my thoughts together because I have like a million things going on all the time. Some of you know me. I used to work with NUICC. I was their coordinator for some time, and I've missed everyone so very much. So you should expect to see me at these, because it's nice to just see your faces, but it's also good to hear about all the work that you're doing and stuff. But so this is my first time working in a colonial government. So I work for the city of New Westminster, and I just started in March, and I'm the only, there's nobody else in the city that's working in this area. So, and I'm the first Indigenous relations advisor that they've ever had. So I'm kind of making things up as I go, which is good in some ways, but really hard in others. And I'm very few people are identified. They don't self-identify with the city. So I don't know. I mean, obviously there's Indigenous people working for the city, but they're not identifying, which tells me there's something going on there, that maybe they're not feeling safe to identify, or maybe they really just aren't there. I don't know. So, you know, for me, every time I come to anything like this, I'm trying to like absorb, how do I bring Indigenous knowledge systems into the government from the inside, you know, and how do I teach, you know, how do I teach them about our governance structures? And, you know, one of the things that I talk quite a bit about is our kinship ties, and that was based on another speaker we had at another time. And so I always give the big long introduction with, you know, saying who I am and who my family is and stuff, and then talk to them about why I'm doing that and why that got, you know, that those kinship ties were part of our governance structure. Because when you know someone's grandmother, all of a sudden you internalize your sense of responsibility to that person. It becomes a duty, a moral duty to do right by that person. And that's why it's so important, and why the breakdown of those kinship ties was so important to the, you know, the colonial violence that was occurring. So, you know, I guess I don't have a question. These are the things that I'm struggling with in my position, is how do I bring that? How do I implement that from the inside out? How do I take our knowledge systems and build the strategies and the things that I'm doing with those right inside to the system? So, you know, I'm trying to reach out to those people that I think can sort of help guide me a little bit. I know I did probably within, I think it was like the first 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, that I like, Becky, I need you. So we had a meeting, and she sat down and talked to me about it, and, you know, shared some of her insights, which gave me some really good direction. And we do have a strategy built for an engagement strategy, because the relationships in New West are really, like, the relationships with the First Nations are really complicated, because there's so many of them that all use the river, and none of them really lived within the city limits of New Westminster unless they were being moved from reserve to reserve to reserve. So all of it's quite new for me. So I guess I just want to say thank you for sharing this with me. And then also, if you do have any thoughts or insights or, you know, advice or anything, I'm soaking it in right now. So, and thank you for sharing, Kamala, Damon, and Becky, and everyone else as well.
It was so good to see you, Christina.
Good to be here.
Yeah, and these are really complex problems. Like, they are complex problems, and the barriers are real. And the barriers are not only historically rooted, but they're also psychologically entrenched. And colonial government, you know, unless people have, and I believe, Kamala, this was you that was saying that there's desperately need an education around alternative forms of governance and of government, because right now those people who are in power cannot fathom, you know, the success of alternative forms of decision making. And so without having access to being able to understand that our current forms of governance are based on false assumptions of supremacy, human supremacy, white supremacy, and male supremacy.
Yeah.
So until they learn to understand that there are alternatives, and I believe that there are successful models that we can learn from.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also a very unfair position to be the one person. So that's a heavy, heavy thing to carry. And that's sort of been the case with all the cities who are now. Burnaby has one. Vancouver originally had one. I mean, I was Aboriginal social planner, but that wasn't even an official position. I was just doing that work. So acknowledge that that's a really heavy thing to carry. So hopefully that will keep expanding, and you can find that support in those allies. But Burnaby, and I looking forward to chatting with you after this, but Burnaby is trying to do more staff training as part of this. So I'm actually doing a video for staff that is, I did it as interviews of people from these territories for people to kind of understand, because like Becky said, there's a lack of knowledge and understanding, but there's also like people just don't even know that they're on someone else's territories, or like the whole history of displacement and erasure and all of that they're part of and that they perpetuate. I guess the main thing I would say, like as hard as it can be, and I know it's a very vulnerable position to be in, and it's not, doesn't always feel safe, but if you feel strong and able to do it, is to just hold strong to your ways of being. And at meetings, like say this isn't, and like I know it's very hard, and sometimes I would cry, and sometimes I'd be like, I can't do this, and that's why I left. But as much as possible, we have to change that culture of white supremacy and colonial ways of doing things by just pushing back and saying, no, this needs to be done like this, or no, every chance you get. And it's exhausting, and it's more than you should have to take on, but just, I guess, to just feel that you have the right to do that, and that you don't have to conform to the colonial system, because the colonial system is a mess, and it's made up, and it's harmful. Yeah. But to know that you can do things in your own way as much as
I mean, I really appreciate that. I think like one thing I do appreciate about NUICC, I really feel like they are quite open. They allow me to be super honest with them. And I don't feel like retaliation or anything like that. So I've appreciated that. And something that I'm implementing myself, and that the city actually seems to be excited about, is I'm having an elder in residence come in once a week. So every Wednesday I'll have an elder in there for the day, and just to have a presence, just to be a presence in City Hall, and to be there as a support for me. But then, just sort of that gentle education where people don't even know they're learning, just by being exposed to it. So I'm looking forward to that. And I think I'll feel a little bit more uplifted, because I'll have at least somebody that I can look at that, knows what I'm thinking. So, and I'm looking forward to talking with you too, Kamala. Thank you.
So I just want to give people, thank you so much for your comments and for sharing, Christina and Kamala. I just want to give folks one more opportunity if they have any final thoughts. Like, we've come to the end of our time. If anybody would like to share any parting words or have any final thoughts, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, Damon here. So I think one of the important things I'll share with you is to look at each of us, to look at how we do things, how we say things to others. Now, we know that Canadians generally, many of them feel threatened by us. And it's not dissimilar to what's happening in the United States with the white nationalists and the neo-Nazis, right? They're truly afraid that we're going to take over, that people of color are going to take over. And so, when I speak publicly, I'm very conscious of what I say publicly, how I say it. You know what I mean? If you're going to change behaviors and change how people think about you, then you have to think about what you're saying to them. And ask yourself the question, am I going to cause more harm with what I'm saying or with what I'm doing? I think if we're sending a message that Indigenous peoples have something truly good to offer Canada, then how do we convince Canadians of that? How do we stop them from hating us? How do we act to make them have confidence in us? And I illustrate just quickly, look at what's happening in South Africa. Nelson Mandela spent 15 years in prison to free his country.
Just
Right?
27 years.
Yeah, okay. And then the next leader that comes behind him, they have to take him out because he's corrupt. Right? And now some Africans are killing colored people from other parts of Africa because they're burning them alive because they say they're taking their jobs or their income. Is that an outcome that Nelson Mandela wanted or would appreciate? And what has caused that to come about? You know, the more we can understand or act to understand the divides that exist between any of us, and in this person, any of us in Canada, you know, we have to ask, what could we change that would create better outcomes for everyone? And it's not about being nice. It's about truly speaking to your audience so that they are willing to hear you, that will truly listen to you. Okay? So that's the last sort of thing I'll leave you to think about. Okay, thank you.
Those are good final words, Damon. Thank you so much. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I would like to invite you to participate at our next event, which will be on September 30th, which will be justice themed. I also would like to invite folks to participate by joining the Knowledge Hub or following us on social media, or continuing to participate in our future events. I also wanted to thank all of our media folks in Boer Urban Labs for their technical support. And I hope to see all of you. Oh, and I'd also actually like to extend a huge thank you to our panelists, both Damon and Kamala, and look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you in the future. So thanks so much, everyone. Take care and have a good weekend and a good rest of your Friday.
Thank you.